They fined me $10,000 for controlling water on my own land. And the wildest part is, they weren't even wrong about one thing. I was controlling it. I just wasn't doing it for the reason they thought. And the day I decided to stop, that's when everything they built started to fall apart. I live just outside a small town in Western Oregon, the kind of place where mornings come in slow and quiet, where the fog hangs low over the trees and the air smells like wet cedar and earth. My property sits at the edge of what used to be untouched woodland, and years before any developers showed up, I carved out a small lake back there. Nothing fancy, nothing you'd see on a brochure. Just a modest stretch of water fed by a narrow creek that runs down from the hills. I built it myself, piece by piece, over the course of 2 long summers, digging, grading, reinforcing the banks, and eventually installing a simple spillway dam. Just a metal gate and a concrete lip, enough to manage water levels when the rains got heavy. It wasn't about control in some power-hungry sense. It was about balance, keeping the shoreline from eroding, making sure the water didn't rush too fast downstream and tear up the soil, protecting the little ecosystem that slowly built itself around that lake. Ducks started nesting there every spring. Frogs filled the evenings with that low, steady chorus, and every now and then you'd see a deer step carefully to the edge to drink. It became part of the land, part of the rhythm of things, and, honestly, part of me too. For years, nobody cared, because there was nobody to care, just me, the trees, and the water doing what it's always done. Then the development came. They cleared out a big chunk of the woods about half a mile downhill and put in one of those polished, neatly packaged neighborhoods. You know the kind, identical houses, trimmed hedges, sidewalks that curved just enough to look natural, but somehow feel anything but. They called it Alder Ridge Estates, which is funny because they bulldozed most of the actual alder trees to build it. At first, it didn't bother me much. People waved when they drove by. A couple of them even stopped to ask about the lake, said it looked peaceful. I figured, all right, maybe we can coexist. Then the HOA formed. Now, I've heard stories about HOAs, everyone has, but I figured most of it was exaggeration, until I met Linda Carver. She introduced herself one afternoon like she was running for office, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like armor, smile tight enough to cut glass. Hi there, I'm Linda, president of the Alder Ridge Homeowners Association. We've been reviewing the surrounding properties and how they might impact our community. I remember leaning on my fence, wiping my hands on a rag, thinking, impact your community? Lady, I've been here longer than your whole neighborhood exists. I kept it polite though, told her the lake had been there for years, that the creek fed into it naturally, and that the spillway just helped regulate overflow. She nodded like she understood, but there was something in her eyes, not curiosity, not concern, something more like calculation. A week later, I found the first notice taped to my gate. No envelope, no knock on the door, just a sheet of paper flapping in the wind like a warning flag. Unauthorized manipulation of community water drainage. I actually laughed when I read it, out loud, stood there in my driveway shaking my head, because it sounded so ridiculous I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Community water? The creek didn't belong to them. The lake didn't belong to them. Hell, the land didn't belong to them. Still, I didn't want things to escalate, so I sent an email, calm, straightforward, explaining the history, that the lake and dam predated the development, that everything sat fully within my property lines, that I wasn't diverting anything, just managing what was already there. No response, not even an acknowledgement. A few days passed, and I figured maybe that was the end of it. Maybe someone realized how absurd it was and quietly dropped it. Then the second letter came. This one was mailed, official-looking, stamped with the HOA logo, tone a whole lot less friendly. They demanded I cease all adjustments to the spillway structure immediately, claiming that my actions posed a potential flooding risk to the neighborhood. That's when I stopped laughing. Because now it wasn't just annoying, it was deliberate. I walked the length of my property that evening, following the creek as it left the lake and wound its way downhill toward their development. I'd seen that path 1,000 times, watched how the water moved during storms, how it spread out naturally across low ground before narrowing again. It had never threatened anything, not once. But I also noticed something new, something they'd changed. Where the creek used to fan out across a patch of open soil, they'd landscaped it, flattened it, planted grass, built a walking path right across the natural drainage area. And suddenly it made sense. It wasn't that my lake was dangerous. It was that their design ignored the way the land actually worked. And now they needed someone to blame. I remember standing there as the light faded, listening to the water move through the trees, and thinking, they're not worried about flooding. They're worried about liability. And somehow, I'd become their easiest target. I should have pushed back harder right then. Maybe called a lawyer, maybe dragged out surveys and permits. But part of me still believed this could be resolved like normal people resolve things, with a conversation, with common sense. I had no idea how wrong I was. A week later, the third letter arrived. And this one changed everything. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a request. It was a fine. $10,000 for unauthorized water control measures affecting community infrastructure. I read it 3 times, slow, like maybe the number would shrink if I looked at it long enough, but it didn't. 10,000. For turning a wheel on a dam I built, on land I owned, to protect a system that had worked just fine until they showed up and decided they understood it better than the land itself. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying everything in my head. The years I spent building that lake, the quiet mornings, the way the fog rolled over the surface at sunrise, and now all of it was being reduced to a violation notice and a bill. And somewhere between frustration and exhaustion, something shifted. Because it finally clicked. They thought I was controlling the water. And as long as they believed that, they believed they could control me. That was their mistake. The next morning, I made coffee the same way I always do, slow, no rush, letting the kettle hum a little longer than it needs to. But everything felt different, like the air had weight to it. Not heavy exactly, just charged, like something was waiting. I spread the HOA letter out on the kitchen table and just stared at it for a while, tracing that number with my finger. $10,000. It wasn't even about the money anymore. Not really. It was the idea behind it, the assumption that they could just decide something about my land and make it real. Around mid-morning, I heard tires on gravel. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Linda didn't knock. She never knocked. She walked straight up to the edge of the yard like she had every right to be there, sunglasses on again, clipboard tucked under her arm. Same smile, but tighter now, like she was expecting resistance and already rehearsing her response. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and leaned against the porch rail. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Hale," she said, voice crisp, professional, the kind people use when they're pretending this isn't personal. "I assume you received the notice." I nodded once. "Yeah, hard to miss." She glanced past me toward the tree line where the lake sat, like she could see it through the woods if she just focused hard enough. "This situation is serious," she continued. "Your dam is interfering with natural drainage patterns that affect the Alder Ridge community." I almost smiled at that, natural drainage patterns. "You mean the ones your contractors paved over?" I said. That hit something. Just for a second, her expression slipped. Not much, just a flicker. Then it snapped right back into place. "Our engineers have assessed the area," she said, a little sharper now. "And they've determined your adjustments could increase runoff velocity during heavy rainfall events." I let out a quiet breath, looked past her toward the road where a couple of neighbors had slowed down, pretending not to watch. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice even, "that water's been moving through this land longer than either of us has been alive. The only thing that changed is what you built downstream." Her jaw tightened. "We're not here to debate history," she replied. "We're here to address a compliance issue." There it was. Compliance. Not truth, not logic, compliance. "And if I don't?" I asked. She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "Then the fine stands, and additional penalties may follow." For a second, neither of us said anything, just the sound of wind moving through the trees, distant, steady, and somewhere out back, a duck calling across the water. Then she turned, like the conversation was over before it even started. "Have a good day, Mr. Hale," she said, already walking back toward her car. I watched her go, and something about the way she carried herself, like she'd already won, that's what stuck with me. Not the fine, not the threat, that certainty, that assumption that I would fold. Over the next few days, things got strange. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before started stopping by, not all at once, not in a group, just one or two at a time, like they didn't want to be seen talking to me. There was a guy named Trevor who lived on the edge of the development, mid-30s, always looked a little tired, like he had more on his plate than he could handle. He stood at my fence one evening, hands shoved in his pockets. "Hey," he said, nodding toward the trees. "That lake of yours, you think it could, flood?" I studied him for a second, not hostile, not accusing, just worried. "No," I said simply. He shifted his weight. "Linda said." I know what Linda said. He hesitated, then gave a small nod, like he didn't fully believe her, but didn't fully believe me either. That's how it spreads, not through facts, but through doubt. A couple days later, an older woman named Marcy came by. She brought cookies, which felt almost surreal given the situation, stood there smiling politely while asking if I'd consider lowering the water level just to be safe. Just to be safe. I told her the same thing, that it was safe, that it had always been safe. She nodded, thanked me, left the cookies, but I could see it in her eyes too. Uncertainty. And that's when it really hit me. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. They were building a narrative, one where I was the unpredictable variable, the guy controlling the water, the potential threat to their neatly ordered world. And the more that idea settled in, the more power they had. That night, I walked out to the dam. The path was familiar, worn in just enough that I didn't need a light. The trees opened up and there it was, the lake stretching out under the fading sky, surface smooth except for the occasional ripple, calm, like it always was. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Water slipping quietly over the spillway, the soft mechanical creak of the gate where I'd adjusted it earlier that week. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just controlled, steady flow. Controlled. That word again. I crouched down near the mechanism, ran my hand along the cold metal wheel. This simple thing, this basic system, had suddenly become the center of everything. Not because of what it did, but because of what they believed it meant. I thought about the fine, about Linda standing in my yard like she owned it, about Trevor and Marcy and all the others who were starting to look at me differently. And then I thought about something else. What would happen if I stopped? Not just ignored them, but actually stopped controlling the water entirely. Let it do exactly what they claimed they wanted, let it follow its natural drainage patterns. The idea sat there for a minute, then another, and the longer I thought about it, the clearer it became. Because here's the thing they didn't understand, or maybe chose not to. The dam wasn't there to create control. It was there to prevent chaos. Without it, the water wouldn't disappear. It would just move differently, faster in some places, wider in others, following paths that had been shaped over decades, paths their development had ignored. I stood up slowly, looking out over the lake, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt calm, not frustrated, not angry, just certain. They wanted to see what it looked like when I wasn't controlling the water? Fine. I could show them. I didn't act on it right away. That's the part people always expect. Some impulsive move, some big emotional reaction. But that's not how it happened. I waited. A week almost. Long enough for things to settle. Long enough for the HOA to assume their pressure was working, that the silence meant compliance. In that time, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in thick, heavy, the kind that hang low and don't move much. The air got damp, cooler, and the forecast started mentioning rain. Not a storm, not anything dramatic, just steady rainfall over a couple days. Perfect. I spent those days walking the property, checking the ground, noting how saturated the soil was getting, listening to the creek as it fed into the lake, the volume rising just enough to notice. By the third day, the water level had climbed a few inches, nothing unusual, nothing concerning. Exactly the kind of situation the spillway was designed to handle. Exactly the kind of situation I'd always managed. But this time, I didn't touch it. I left the gate exactly where it was. And I waited. The morning it happened, everything felt still, not quiet. The rain had stopped overnight, and you could hear water everywhere if you listened, dripping from branches, moving through the undergrowth, feeding into the lake in a steady, patient flow. But the air itself felt paused, like the land was holding its breath. I saw Linda's car drive through the neighborhood around mid-morning, slow, deliberate, like she was doing one of her routine inspections, checking boxes, making notes, making sure everything stayed exactly the way she thought it should be. That's when I knew. I grabbed my jacket, walked out toward the lake, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, every step familiar, every sound sharper than usual. When I reached the dam, the water was right where I expected it to be, high, but stable, pressing gently against the gate, waiting. I stood there, looking at it, feeling that same mix of calm and anticipation building again. This was the moment. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. They believed I was the one controlling everything. So I reached down, wrapped my hand around that cold metal wheel. And this time, I was going to prove them wrong. I didn't rush it. That's the part people always get wrong when they imagine a moment like this. They think it's fast, impulsive, dramatic, but it wasn't. It was slow, deliberate, almost quiet in a way that makes everything feel louder. My hand tightened around the wheel, cold metal biting into my palm, and for a second I just stood there, listening. The lake behind the dam pressing steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world, because it did. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and then I started turning. At first, nothing happened, just the low groan of the mechanism waking up, gears grinding against years of use. A sound I'd heard 100 times before, but never like this, never with this kind of weight behind it. Then the gate shifted, just a little, and the water responded immediately. You could hear it before you could really see it. That deep, sudden rush as pressure found an opening, the sound swelling like something alive, something finally given permission to move. I kept turning. The opening widened, and the lake answered. Water surged through the spillway, not violently, not out of control, just powerfully, confidently, like it knew exactly where it was supposed to go, down the channel, through the trees, following paths carved long before any of us were here pretending we understood them. Within seconds, the sound carried. You could hear it echoing through the woods, bouncing off the edges of the development downhill. And that's when the first shout came. Distant at first, confused. Then another. I stopped turning and stepped back, watching as the flow settled into a steady, unstoppable stream. Not chaotic, not destructive, just natural. Footsteps pounded somewhere beyond the trees. Voices, louder now, sharper, edged with panic. I didn't move. I just stood there beside the dam, hands resting lightly at my sides, and waited. It didn't take long. A couple of the neighbors came into view first, pushing through the edge of the tree line, eyes wide, scanning everything like they expected to see something breaking, something collapsing. "Hey, what's happening?" one of them yelled, breathless. I nodded toward the spillway. "Water's moving." That's too much, isn't it?" Another said, looking past me like the lake might suddenly spill over and swallow everything. I shook my head. "No, this is what it does." More people gathered behind them, a small cluster forming, voices overlapping, questions bouncing around without answers, and then, cutting through all of it, Linda. She came in fast, heels not quite made for uneven ground, but she didn't slow down, not until she saw it. The water, flowing, free. Her face changed in a way I don't think she even realized. Not anger, not right away, something closer to disbelief, like reality had just stepped slightly out of line with what she expected. "What did you do?" she demanded, breath tight. I met her eyes calm. "Nothing you didn't ask for." Her gaze snapped back to the spillway, then downstream, like she was trying to calculate something in real time. "You need to stop this," she said, sharper now, urgency creeping in. "This could overwhelm our drainage system." I tilted my head just a little. "I thought you said I shouldn't be controlling the water." "That's not what this is." "No." I cut in, not raising my voice, just steady. "This is exactly what that is. This is the water doing what it's always done, without me interfering." For a second, she didn't have an answer. And that silence, that was louder than anything. Because right about then, the real consequences started showing up. Not here, not at the dam, but down in Alder Ridge. You could see it in the distance first, movement where there shouldn't be movement, water spreading across the edges of their perfectly trimmed green space, slipping over the walking paths they'd poured right through the natural drainage area. Someone shouted from further down, voice sharp with panic. "It's flooding the park." Another voice. "The paths are underwater." A ripple of realization moved through the group, standing near me. Heads turning, eyes widening, pieces clicking into place all at once. Because here's the thing nobody likes to admit until they have to see it. The land remembers. It remembers where the water used to go. And when you block those paths, it doesn't disappear. It just finds them again. Linda turned back toward me, and now the anger was there, fully formed, but underneath it, something else. "Fear. You need to fix this," she said, almost pleading now. Lower the gate, do something. I looked past her, toward the direction of the neighborhood, listening to the distant chaos, splashing, shouting, that confused kind of noise people make when things stop behaving the way they expect. Then I looked back at her. For years, I said quietly, I've been managing this so it doesn't do that. Not for control, for balance. And you find me for it. Her jaw tightened. That's not. You said I was the problem. I continued, still calm, still steady, so I stepped out of the way. That landed. You could see it. Not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. Around us, the neighbors had gone quiet. Not because things were better, but because they were watching, listening, realizing this wasn't some random failure. This was a consequence. And the worst part? The houses were fine. Bone dry. All that fear, all that talk about flooding homes, it never happened. The water stayed exactly where it had always gone. Low ground, open space, the same space they'd turned into decorative landscaping and walking paths because it looked nicer on a brochure. Down below, benches sat half submerged, flower beds blurred into muddy patches, and that carefully manicured lawn, the one they were so proud of, now rippled under a thin layer of moving water. Not destroyed, just reminded. Linda exhaled slowly, like the fight had drained out of her all at once, her shoulders dropping just enough to notice. What do you want? She asked finally. There it was. Not authority, not demands. A question. I considered it for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to make sure she heard it the way it needed to be heard. I want you to understand, I said, that this, I gestured toward the water, the trees, the land itself, isn't something you control with paperwork. You don't get to redraw how it works just because it's inconvenient. She didn't respond, didn't argue, just stood there, watching the water like she was seeing it for the first time, not as a problem to manage, but as something bigger than her. I stepped back toward the dam, rested my hand on the wheel again, and after a moment, slowly, carefully, I began to close the gate. The flow eased. Not instantly, not dramatically, just gradually, like the land was exhaling, returning to that balance it had held for years. No one said anything. They just watched. And when it was done, when the water settled back into its quiet, steady rhythm, something had changed. Not the lake. Not the creek. Them. The HOA didn't send another letter. The fine? Gone. Just disappeared, like it had never been issued. No apology, of course. People like that don't apologize, but they didn't push again either. Linda stopped coming by, stopped inspecting, stopped pretending my land was part of her domain. And the neighbors? That was the interesting part. Trevor came back a few days later, leaned on the same fence, looked out toward the trees. Guess you were right, he said. I shrugged. Wasn't about being right. He nodded slowly, like he understood a little more than before, then added, almost under his breath, they shouldn't have pushed it. Marcy still brought cookies, but this time, she didn't ask me to change anything, just handed them over, smiled, and said, thank you for fixing it. I didn't correct her, because in a way, I had, just not the way they expected. These days, things are quiet again. Mornings go back to that slow, steady rhythm. Fog over the water, ducks along the edge, frogs calling when the sun dips low, the same as it's always been. And every now and then, when I walk past the dam, I pause, rest my hand on that wheel, feel the weight of it, not as a symbol of control, but as a reminder that sometimes the only way to show people the truth is to step back and let it happen. Now here's the thing I keep coming back to, and I'm curious what you think about it. Was I right to do that? I didn't damage their homes. I didn't break anything that wasn't already forced into the wrong place, but I did let it happen, knowing exactly what it would show them. So where's the line? Between standing your ground and proving a point the hard way? I'd really like to hear your take on it. Would you have done the same thing or handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this one, it still sticks with me.